Well, thank you, Kathie, for sitting down with us. We wanted to archive some of the Southern AIDS Coalition history and how SAC came about and why it was necessary at that time.
I think that's great. I would hate to lose the history of SAC because I feel like it's important in the AIDS movement. So, you want me to just start? Okay. Well, I think the genesis of SAC was around 2001. And NASDAD, which is the National Association of State and Territorial AIDS Directors, had a group of discontented Southern AIDS directors. And they were unhappy because they realized that the epidemic was Southern, and yet the South was not getting anywhere near a proportionate amount of money. So they got together and formed what they called the Southern AIDS Directors of NASDAD. And they worked together on issues and put some research together. But it wasn't very long before they realized that as state AIDS directors, they were somewhat limited in what they could do, especially in the realms of advocacy. So they decided they needed to include the community. So they held a couple or maybe 3 meetings, and also included the pharmaceutical industry as well, because everyone knows they're key partners in this work. And I did not go to the first meeting myself, which I believe was in Charlotte, but I did go to the one in Tampa, I believe in 2002. And that's when I met this cast of zany characters. And I had to laugh then because they eventually formed what they called the Southern AIDS Directors Southern AIDS Coalition as they broadened the coalition. But then they realized that acronym stood for SAD SAC. So they decided they couldn't call it that, and they changed the name just to Southern AIDS Coalition and started including the community leaders, some of the ASOs, AIDS service organizations, as well as industry partners.
So who were some of those early champions? I know the AIDS Institute is in Florida. Was that Florida AIDS Action at the time? At
the time it was Florida AIDS Action, and their executive director was Gene Campbell. He's deceased now. 2 other of the main characters were Evelyn Faust, who at the time was the AIDS director in North Carolina, and her right arm man, who was Steve Sherman, who ran the ADAP program there. He's also deceased now. And then Beth Scalco, who was the AIDS director in Louisiana. And of course I got really involved. I would say in the industry side, Mick Sullivan was extremely involved. He was with Janssen, Tech, whatever the name of it was then. Kathie Kavanaugh with Vive, which was GlaxoSmithKline at the time. And there were a lot of us who were very involved, and we started trying to get as much media attention in the South as we could, going around to conferences and presenting some case studies. And I have to say, the case studies that were originally put together by Steve Sherman and Beth Scalco were very powerful. I mean, I still have those, by the way, if you want those. I used to use those in presentations all the time because it showed so clearly that we were fighting for a very just cause. And that is, you could look at, for example, a metropolitan area such as Minneapolis, St. Paul, say, and I may be getting these wrong, but compared to a whole state like South Carolina. And they would have almost exactly the same number of cases that they were dealing with. And yet, because of the Part A, Part B conundrum of Ryan White, where the Part A urban areas get double funded and more proportionately, they were getting about twice as much per case in every case study that we showed. And we caused a pretty big stink with that. And we started also aligning ourselves with politicians, and especially Southern politicians, trying to get the word out that they were getting the short end of the stick.
Right. And even some of the conservative politicians really responded to that because they didn't want their states to be on the losing end.
Absolutely. I should say, too, Jane Cheeks, the AIDS director from Alabama, was also one of the founding members. There were a handful of them that were really key in this. Yeah, so we ended up, they say politics makes strange bedfellows. We did end up with some unexpected warriors in this. And a good example is right here in Alabama, Senator Jeff Sessions, who is generally very conservative. We discovered his pet peeve is getting cheated on federal funding. And he says it happens to Alabama all the time. So he was all about it. And there were a team, particularly in the Senate, of Senator Sessions, Senator Enzi from Wyoming, who actually sent me that red line copy of the bill after it passed. But Senator Coburn in Oklahoma and Senator Burr in North Carolina was key. And, you know, these guys were getting up and fighting for us on the Senate floor as we attempted to do the unthinkable, which is change the formula for the Ryan White legislation.
And that was one of SAC's first hallmarks, was really getting Ryan White reauthorized and getting the funding redistributed.
That's right. So we worked on this for years. And I mean, we had press conferences. We came out with the Southern States Manifesto. There had been an original document in 2003. And then we wrote another document, I'm trying to remember, 2005, I believe, is when it came out, July of 2005, updating it, and it was a lot slicker, better document than the first one had been. And boy, did it get a lot of traction. You know, I have to say that update of the Southern States Manifesto was like the lead news story on MSNBC or one of those big network news stations online. And you know, we got an unbelievable amount of press coverage on this. We were on National Public Radio, almost every newspaper across the country. I got an editorial in the San Francisco Chronicle. You know, it was amazing the amount of interest that we stirred up in this. But I will say we worked on that Ryan White reauthorization for years. And it finally came to fruition and was changed somewhat in December of 2006. I'll never forget, as long as I live, I had been working on that for so long, and I was by myself in a hotel room, laid up in bed, streaming it, and it was the last thing that the Senate dealt with that year, and they passed it at like midnight. And the next morning, you know, was talking to Beth Scalco, and I was like, it passed, and somebody said, yeah, we had a baby. And she said, it's an ugly baby, you know, because it's not a pretty piece of legislation. I don't know if you've ever actually looked at the legislation, but it is the hundreds of pages of just amendments. I mean, it's one of the craziest things you've ever seen in your life. And I often say, why can't this be simpler? You know, why can't funding just follow the epidemic and actually flow to where people are living with HIV and AIDS? But that being said, it's political and complicated, you know. But I am very proud of that accomplishment. We got more than $30 million a year shifted to the South every year from then on.
Right.
So that was December 06.
And the disparity in funding now, where it was double, it was maybe over $1,000, and it's maybe closer to $100 difference or something like that. It's narrowed greatly because of that piece of legislation.
Absolutely, but keep in mind that even if now it's only $100 per person, you multiply that by half the epidemic in the South, and you're talking a lot of money.
Certainly.
So it's nothing to sneeze at.
Right.
But at the same time, you're right. It was a major accomplishment.
Sure. So, given that, how do you see this work continuing, and as the organization's grown over the years, how do you see it evolving, and what direction are we going now?
Well, you know, there's been a lot of change in the epidemic even since we started the Southern AIDS Coalition. One of the biggest changes I've seen is the move more toward a biomedical response to the epidemic. So by that I mean, you know, the various things. There's the study that shows that if people are on medications and successful in suppressing their viral load, they can't really transmit the disease to others. You know, the work on vaccines and microbicides continues. There's now research that proves that pre-exposure prophylaxis works. So you've got that whole issue. You've got viral load mapping, where you can actually go, now that everyone's required to report viral load and so on, you can go into an area and see where the concentration of HIV is, and therefore you can know where the riskier areas geographically are. So you've got all this new stuff, but here's the bottom line. You know, we can try to fight this epidemic with all of these biomedical measures and with traditional prevention and everything, but we'll never get a handle on the epidemic until we're able to make some progress in the South. Because clearly, if we have, according to the CDC, as the South is defined, half of the epidemic, we can't ignore that. And, you know, it's wonderful that President Obama in July of 2010 came out with the country's first HIV/AIDS strategy. I will say I had to fight tooth and nail to get them to mention the South in that. That was a real struggle. I got so mad on a call one day I cried. When I get mad, I cry, and I was just infuriated because they did not want to mention any specific geographic area. And that just made no sense to me, because as we're looking at science, you know, if a particular ethnicity is impacted, which they are, you know, if you're looking at blacks or Latinos and how disproportionately impacted they are by the epidemic, we talk about that. If you look at young black men who have sex with men being disproportionately impacted, we talk about that. And yet we're not supposed to talk about the fact that the South is disproportionately impacted. That was infuriating to me. So I finally was able to get them to include the South in the strategy, but everywhere that it says the South is the most impacted, it says the South and the Northeast. Now, that's okay, you know, because the Northeast is very impacted as well.
As far as prevalence.
As far as prevalence, right. As far as incidence and mortality rates, though, the South is where it is. So yeah, I mean, clearly we've got to pay more attention and put more resources in the South.
Certainly. Well, I think that really answers the question of why this work is so important and why you're so passionate about it, and how it has to continue, how SAC as an organization has to evolve, because there's still very real needs as it comes to the South. It's still an uphill battle, and even getting the South recognized at the national level.
You know, I have to laugh because we've come so far in the United States as far as trying to get rid of different kinds of prejudices and bigotry. And while, of course, it's not gone, you know, we've made great steps in reducing bigotry around ethnicities and gender stereotypes. But the one prejudice that is still politically acceptable is to make fun of the South. And I find that very offensive, because we're not all a bunch of rubes down here who are uneducated and can't talk. So, you know, yes, absolutely we are a conservative part of the country, and that probably doesn't help us in our fight against the epidemic. But the bottom line, and my bottom line is always going to be the people living with HIV disease in the South. And we got more of those than anybody else does. So we need to quit pointing fingers and placing blame, and try to figure out a way that we can all work together as a country to improve the outlook of people living with HIV in the South, and to reduce the incidence and mortality, as you were saying. Yeah.
Well, I think that answers a lot of our history questions. I don't know if you would want to add anything personally about your experience as a board member for new board members, and kind of what that's been to you, and maybe what they'll gain, or...
Well, I will say I'm extremely proud to be a part of the Southern AIDS Coalition. I feel like we did more to fight the epidemic in the South than any group has ever done. And not only that, you know, if you look at past reauthorizations of the Ryan-White Act, for example, this had always been a battle, but on a much smaller scale. And this was the first time we ever had any real success. And that's not our only success, you know. I think largely due to the work that SAC has done, the CDC changed the way that they put out their funding so that it's based on living HIV and AIDS cases, which is a great thing, because, you know, they're actually putting the money where the burden of the epidemic is the worst.
And they didn't have a funding formula prior to that.
No, it was very interesting. I was at a federal meeting where they were explaining how the different agencies fund. And when I asked about the CDC, the lady very clearly said, and I believe it was Janet Cleveland from the CDC, said, well, we've never had a formula before. And I was shocked at that. I had no idea. You know, I thought it was one of the archaic formulas that base everything on AIDS or cumulative AIDS, including deceased people. But no, there was no
There
formula.
just wasn't one.
There wasn't one. So now they do have a formula. We're working right now trying to get the housing legislation changed.
Mhm.
It's one of the ones based on cumulative AIDS cases and double funds, about 30, 31 of the biggest cities.
Right.
So again, that's ridiculous. That piece of legislation funds more deceased people than living people. It's distributed based
For housing.
for housing, right? That's for housing. So we still have some work to do. There's no doubt about it. But nobody needs this help more than the South. And I think SAC has a very critical role to play as we continue trying to beat this epidemic.
Well, thank you, Kathie.
You're
Thank you
welcome.
for your time.
Absolutely, anytime.